So we will be proceeding with the webinar titled Resisting Apartheid, Decolonising UK Campuses, with incredible speakers who have shown their support for this new student-led initiative, Apartheid Off Campus, including Adam Abdullah, a student activist from the University of Leeds, Malia Bouattia, and Lowkey. So we're here today because despite student organisations and the societies around the UK having a history for fighting for social and environmental justice, from LGBT+ rights to divesting from fossil fuel companies, UK universities remain deeply complicit with Israel's apartheid regime through their institutional and investment links. Israel's system of occupation, colonization, militarization, and institutionalized structures of racist discrimination through policies of segregation, imprisonment, and racial profiling amount to the crime of apartheid. Such a system of oppression can only be sustained with the financial and diplomatic support from governments and institutions across the world, including UK universities. In fact, UK universities invest over 450 million into companies who sustain Israel's illegal settlement economy and arms trade. They also hold partnerships with such companies and institutions, including Israeli institutions. One example includes the University of Manchester, who invest hundreds of thousands of pounds into the company Caterpillar, which supplies the Israeli army with bulldozers which are weaponized and used to demolish Palestinian communities, demolish Palestinian schools and civil infrastructure to make way for the ever-expanding illegal Israeli Jewish-only settlements. University of Manchester, just like many other institutions, also has a partnership with Technion, Israel's state of technology. Technion are Israel's leading research and development institute for Israel's arms trade. Israel's arms trade, which markets their weapons as battle-tested, due to them being tested on Palestinian civilians in Gaza, who've been living under the world's largest open-air prison in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. They have been living under a lockdown for over a decade, essentially, and now are within a lockdown within a lockdown. I'm delighted that this webinar is happening on behalf and is the first official webinar for Apartheid Off Campus, and I'm honoured to be speaking on their behalf. And it's a student-led independent initiative to build a mass movement across the UK to kick apartheid off campus and end university complicity with Israeli apartheid. From our launch, which has happened 2 weeks ago today, we've already received over thousands of messages of support and followers on all of our social media platforms. When we officially launched, we were accompanied by activists and students, hundreds of students, in fact, from across the world, across the UK and in Palestine, showing messages of solidarity and support for the initiative and to enhance the call to decolonize universities and get apartheid off campus. So on that note, this webinar will discuss the need for solid action to decolonize our universities, to mobilize the student body and build solidarity across struggles to kick apartheid off campus. On that note, I will hand over to Adam Abdullah, who is a campaigner at Apartheid Off Campus and student of Arabic and politics at the University of Leeds. He is also an activist of Palestinian human rights and against the university's complicity of their violations. He has been involved in human rights activism since the beginning of his degree, most notably in the 2019 successful Leeds divestment campaign, which I believe Adam is going to tell us a little bit more about now.
Thank you so much, Huda, for this lovely opportunity and for introducing me. Before I start, I just want to send a message of solidarity and bring everyone's attention to the fact that there are Palestinian students suffering in Israeli jails right now, and more of them are being imprisoned. So first of all, allow me to say how honored and proud I am to be speaking on this amazing panel. I hope that I will do good on my role to represent my comrades in the student movement. They are the ones who always inspire me and push me to do more for Palestine. In my first year of university, I was incredibly lucky to be involved with the Palestine Solidarity Group, a move that felt natural as a Palestinian student in the diaspora. We were working on what was to be the first successful university divestment campaign in the UK. All of us were appalled to find out that our university invested millions of pounds in the companies that were not only directly complicit in Israeli apartheid regime against Palestinians, but also profited from this racist endeavor. We organized, gathered support, struggled, and eventually in November 2018, the university divested. The key to our success was that we were able to collaborate with many student societies on our campus, such as People and Planet, to unite behind one shared cause: ending complicity in human rights violations. We connected our issue to the militarization and marketization of our education, to the oppression of refugees, the need to decolonize our campuses, and the damage that the arms sector does to our environment. It is also important to mention that we were supported by the Manchester University BDS campaign, without whom we would have never succeeded in pressuring the university. This shows how important unity across campuses really is. In other words, we realized back then that if our oppressors are united, we have no other choice but to resist, united, in spite of the divisions that are imposed on us by them. But we didn't stop there. This year, together with SOAS PALSOC and help from Huda, we launched our first ethical university campaign, which aims to cut ties of SOAS and Leeds to any academic institution which is complicit in human rights violations. An example of such an institution is the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which not only is deeply involved in the military apartheid oppression of Palestinians, but also provides its students with accommodation built on stolen Palestinian land in occupied East Jerusalem. This amounts to a war crime, which both SOAS and my University of Leeds are directly complicit in by sending their students there. We need to put an end to this. Our campaign is ongoing, and we shall not rest until it is just as successful as our last one. That is why I am so excited and proud to be working on the launching of Apartheid Off Campus, a new independent, student-led grassroots network aimed at supporting the decolonization of our campuses and education, and ending all the links and our investments in Israeli apartheid. Our movement's goal is to unite and empower students across the UK and beyond who are committed to the values of freedom, justice, equality, and decolonization. We are growing by the day, and we will not stop until the complicity and normalization of our academic institutions with Israeli apartheid are terminated. I remember back in 2018, Evie, my close friend and co-president of Leeds PSG, said, "Our education can no longer be at the expense of human rights." If you agree with Evie and feel inspired by people like Huda, Malia, or Lowkey, then join our movement today and be part of the change that will terminate our university's complicity and normalization with Israeli apartheid. It's time to kick apartheid off campus. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. That was incredibly inspiring and so motivating to hear from a student activist like yourself about the potential of what we can do and what's already been done through collaborative work across the student movement. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who I'm more than honoured to be introducing. It's Malia Bouattia. She was actually the president of NUS whilst I was a student, and an incredible inspiration for me ever since then. She was the best president we've ever had at the NUS, if you ask my opinion, and she's now currently the editor of Red Pepper and continues to vocalise and show and is active in the movement for social justice and for human rights overall. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Malia.
Thank you, Huda. Hello, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. I want to start by actually thanking Huda for inviting me to speak alongside all the activists that have been involved in the setting up of the network and making today's incredible event possible. In many ways, I think that the Apartheid Off Campus network could not have come at a more necessary time. It follows years of total battering from the Israel lobby and its allies on the right, the targeting of Palestine solidarity efforts, international attempts to render BDS illegal, and the character assassination of emerging leaders and vocal frontline comrades, especially within a UK context. Throughout the onslaught of the last decade at least, a space like this hasn't existed in a long time. There's of course been many campaigns that have had national coordination, but what differs and makes our support for this project all the more important is the explicit intentions and demands laid out, as well as the tools that the network seeks to provide for what many of us hope will be thousands of activists across the UK. So we've witnessed some incredible efforts on decolonizing our institutions, for example, or disarmament campaigns, or divestment work, with particular students' unions having a crucial impact, and all of which has kept the fire going in the face of huge opposition. But a network of this nature will hopefully allow us to retain these skills, successes, and knowledge so that we can, so that it can be replicated on a much larger scale. Forcing one institution into considering ethical investments is one thing, but only when we can make it a reality across higher education can we start really talking about structural impacts. Similarly, when SOAS, students and academics managed to hold and win a referendum over the academic boycott, it was easy for managers to ignore the vote as long as it was isolated on campus. At the time, what was needed was to actually replicate the vote across the country, spreading and mimicking the best examples across the UK becomes possible once a powerful network like this one exists. The value of collective mobilized actions from below really cannot be stressed enough. The right and all those opposed to the liberation of Palestine are feeling empowered by the political times, with Trump's deal of the century, the formation of the Israeli unity government, and a clear plan for upcoming annexation. In the UK, the defeat of the Corbyn project was largely made possible through the vilification of the Palestine solidarity movement and contributed in destroying much of our existing infrastructure. The power imbalances feel impossible and will continue to do so as long as we are isolated, which makes the need for coalitions on the ground that much more important. We have to be rethinking our methods of organising and broadening our base, more than just linking with other societies. What long-term methods can we implement on a local level to be sure that this political work continues? I know Huda asked me to reflect on my past experiences of campaigning, but I'm happy to draw on it much more in the Q&A if people want. But I will say that each policy that was passed on a national level, resource that was produced or campaign launched, it was a collective coordinated strategy with local Palestine societies, activists, and national groups. We never struck on the basis that something was popular, but rather that it was necessary and the right thing to do. Having discussions, building across different political groups and experiences, linking the work with calls from Palestinian civil society, bridging the link historically with other struggles, and adopting new tactics, despite the possibility of them not being successful, were just some of the methods that we had adopted as many of us sought to launch a stronger call for the boycott, divestment, and sanctioning of Israel. In the last few years, I've reflected a lot about NUS in the time that I was there, and the experience surrounding Palestine solidarity, as well as that of Corbyn. And the main issue, I think, with both projects was the ability to take on the machine in the face of a lack of organisation on the ground. It often felt like having a head without the body. So whilst I was attacked in the media, undermined by the bureaucracy inside my own union, and faced the manoeuvres of my political opponents, there was very little independent activism that could build pressure from below and transform national demands into practical realities on the ground. Much of the same can be said about the experience in the Labour Party in recent years. Whilst the attacks rained down on the Corbyn leadership, where were the collective movements, demonstrations, boycott campaigns that could support the most progressive positions of the party and fight back against the smears and delegitimization? The absence of those is our collective failure, and I have great hopes that this network is the beginning of addressing this weakness. Right now, it seems like the poor and most vulnerable are being asked to put things into perspective. Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, should they dare to demand accountability for world leaders who are responsible for providing the perfect condition for the virus to spread, thrive, and kill? Well, this pandemic is also an opportunity for us to highlight the truths of this reality, that a military occupation and siege were already unbearable, have led to the ethnic cleansing, dispossession, displacement, and continued systematic oppression of the Palestinian people. And the impacts of this pandemic have only further exacerbated that situation. If there's a case for prisons being unethical breeding grounds for viruses, that detention under such circumstances is inhumane, then how can there be a continued case for Israel? We have to be loud and we have to be explicit that we cannot continue to allow the complicity of our institutions with the apartheid carried out by the Israeli state. Ironically, one of the victories of the student movement in recent years has been our ability to bring the question of decolonization to the forefront of the national agenda in higher education. Unfortunately, this is now more and more often used by university managers as something to put in brochures, as marketing tools to attract potential clients, students. Again, this is the outcome of our ability to shape the national conversation without being able to drive the success across campuses and make it a practical reality. The struggle now is to say that decolonization is not a metaphor. We mean it literally. Decolonization means treating migrant workers with respect in our institutions, addressing the racial pay and attainment gap, and crucially, refusing the continued use of our fees and our institutions to normalize, fund, and support the ongoing colonization of Palestine. The task is huge, but it's necessary and it is just. This work is urgent, challenging, and fundamental. It's a struggle over who runs our campuses and for what end. It is in times of crisis that these questions get answered, and the crisis is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malia. That was incredible to hear from yourself, and so encouraging as well, I think, for not just myself, but all of the incredible students who are behind driving Apartheid Off Campus, to hear those words come from yourself and to know that we're heading in the right direction. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our final, but of course not least, speaker, Lowkey, who is a British Iraqi rapper, an incredible activist, and who's been an inspiration for many of us for many, many years. So I'd like to hand it over to Lowkey now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huda. Thank you, Malia, and thank you, Adam, for your contributions, not just today, but to the movement over the past few years. They have been irreplaceable, frankly, to be completely honest with you. We exist at a time where there is a global effort to make BDS illegal, from the United States to Germany to France to Boris Johnson, and before him, David Cameron. Yes, we had the recent victory regarding pension law in the US High Court, finding that people should have the right to decide how their money will be invested in order to come back to them in their pensions. And that's something we welcome and we rightly celebrate. However, we have to be absolutely clear. Boris Johnson, in his Queen's speech, made absolutely crystal clear the next aim was to follow on what we have seen in almost half the states of the US, in France and in Germany, with similar legislation in this country. I'm going to get onto some of that in a second, but I also wanted to go off something that Malia made the point of regarding the Corbyn moment. We had a reticence in speaking about Zionism during this period of time. It was turned into an impolite topic of conversation. But we, in fact, exist in a country that has a rich history of Jewish anti-Zionism. We allowed the idea that anti-Zionism was somehow anti-Semitic to dominate our discourse. And I speak about myself firstly. And yes, that was off the back of a very sophisticated campaign of bullying and intimidation in the public sphere. When the Balfour Declaration was being written over 3 years, Chaim Weizmann, a professor from Manchester University, was tirelessly working to get the British government to make this commitment to the Zionist movement. The number one opponent in the British government to the passing of the Balfour Declaration was a gentleman by the name of Edwin Montagu. He was the cousin of Herbert Samuel, and he was the only Jewish member of the inner circle of that government. And his opposition to it was on the basis that, number one, it would lead to the displacement of Palestinians, but number two, that it would make Jewish people in all other countries around the world less safe and less at home. And this was an argument that, unfortunately, we were unable to articulate effectively in the most recent history. I, for one, think it is essential that we bring back and revitalize that history that exists. Only 53% of British Jewish people consider themselves to be Zionists. So we have to be absolutely clear that implicit within Zionism, and in fact explicit, if you read the Judenstaat, Theodor Herzl's book, where he says we must spirit the penniless population across the borders, is the displacement of the up to 800,000 people that the Nakba entailed, that we are marking the 72-year anniversary of. To really lead off of a point that was made by Omar Barghouti recently, if you are a person attempting to enter the United States from Mexico today, the technology which is keeping you back is partly put in place by Elbit systems. If you are somebody fleeing the South Sudan from war, you are fleeing from military structures that have been developed partly by Israeli military specialists. If you are coming from Kashmir, you may have had an experience with military prowess that was developed by the Israelis. If you are somebody in Myanmar or one of the Rohingya trying to leave the area you are in, then you may also be somehow targeted by technology that was developed in the state of Israel. If you look at people that have died in the Mediterranean to the tune of 30,000 people plus over the last few decades, thanks to the European Union's Frontex agency, part of that is due to drone technology that was developed with the help of the Israeli state. We have more people on our side than we are aware of, and we are part of the global majority who understand what the Palestinians are facing and relate to the over 12 million Palestinians across the world. Article 11 of UN Resolution 194 makes absolutely clear the Palestinians have the right to return home. What happens when they attempt to return home? They are shot down, as we have seen Palestinians in Gaza, as we've seen happen to them. And of course, the preventing of them from returning to their homes is actually something prohibited under the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But we know generally it's only leaders from the global south who get prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. While we say that BDS is a peaceful method of resistance, which has been supported far and wide by figures such as Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu, we also should never forget that the Palestinians have the right, according to UN Resolution 3246, to armed resistance under international law. And as Eduardo Galeano said, It's worthwhile to die for things without which it is not worthwhile to live. There are many ways in which Israel can be defined as an apartheid state. The UN Convention Against Apartheid puts it like this: any measures designed to divide the population along racial lines, prohibition of mixed marriages, expropriation of landed property belonging to a racial group qualifies as apartheid. We can't forget that Hendrik Verwoerd, the Prime Minister of South Africa in the 1960s, actually said, Israel is like South Africa. It is an apartheid state. We know that the citizenship law does not allow full family unification for Palestinians, but in contrast to that, the law of return allows a Jewish person from anywhere in the world to claim Israeli citizenship. Even if somebody has one grandparent that they can claim is Jewish, they have the right to Israeli citizenship. And there are distinctions within Israeli citizenship between the nationality. So somebody can have a Jewish nationality, someone can have an Arab nationality, someone can have a Russian nationality or a Syrian nationality. There are three ways in which Jewish nationality is privileged ahead of the others. They can get citizenship automatically through the law of return. The Jewish National Fund and Jewish Agency are considered to represent Jewish people worldwide and have semi-governmental status. And when talking about Palestinians, the third way, they have no legal right for appealing against the exclusive national rights that Jewish people enjoy. So Palestinians have no national rights. The Palestinian group Adala has found 50 different laws within Israel which advantage Jewish people within the society. The former Speaker of the Knesset, Avram Berg, actually said, it's either racism or democracy. You can't have both. And even, of all people, the State Department in the United States has said that Israel practices institutional and societal discrimination. When we refer to what Israel does and Zionism as colonialism, we are not some radical minority. In fact, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who has more streets in Israel named after him than anyone, put it in this way: every indigenous people will resist alien settlers. That's not coming from me, that's coming from Jabotinsky, who, I'll have you know, is the inspiration for Benjamin Netanyahu and the political trend that he represents. How can we forget Manchester's own Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, following the Balfour Declaration, made the following statement about the Palestinians. With regard to the Arab question, the British told me there are several 100,000 Negroes there, but that this matter has no significance. Racism is intrinsically part of the Israeli state. And anybody that is in denial of this fact is really not thinking clearly. Moshe Dayan, who was, of course, the defense minister, who was instrumental in squashing the Palestinian uprising in the 30s, alongside the British officer Wingate, Moshe Dayan put it like this: there is not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. If you have a legal system which enforces discrimination on the basis of national identity, then that is pretty clearly an apartheid state. Now, of course, we know that what Boris Johnson is attempting to continue now is merely continuing along the trajectory that David Cameron attempted to put in place in 2016. But how can we forget? In 1989, even after the Apartheid Act in US Congress, the Anti-Apartheid Act in US Congress, even after Barclays Bank had pulled out of South Africa, David Cameron was sent on a trip to apartheid South Africa, paid for by an anti-sanctions lobbying firm. This was in 1989. Desmond Tutu put it the following way. In South Africa, we could not have achieved our democracy without the help of people around the world, who through the use of non-violent means such as boycotts, divestments, encourage their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime. The same issues of inequality and injustice today motivate the divestment movement trying to end Israel's decades-long occupation of Palestinian territory and the unfair and prejudicial treatment of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government ruling over them. Where culture went, politics eventually followed in the South African example. You had people all across Europe refusing to buy fruit that came from apartheid South Africa. You had dock workers from Liverpool, from places like Melbourne in Australia, refusing, can you see, oh, can you still see me? Okay, refusing to handle goods that they knew came from apartheid South Africa. And the soundtrack to that process was Free Nelson Mandela by figures like Jerry Dammers and the Specials. It was Sun City by Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen. In fact, the Musicians Union in this country claimed to be the first trade grouping which banned its members from traveling and working in apartheid South Africa. It was that movement of culture and that bottom-up pressure that forced the Anti-Apartheid Act in US Congress in 1986, Chase and Barclays, the biggest banks in the world, withdrawing their presence from South Africa. It led to British trade with apartheid South Africa almost completely ceasing. And at one point, 28% of South Africa's exports were going to Britain. So we do have precedent. But the question I would like to ask is this. Today, we understand that to think that 13% of the South African population can rule 87% of the South African population is completely beyond all realms of logic and rationality. We know that when the Specials were singing Free Nelson Mandela in 1984, David Cameron was calling for his execution. Theresa May was doing nothing. Jeremy Corbyn was getting arrested for opposing apartheid. Israel and Shimon Peres were trying to sell nuclear weapons to apartheid. And today, there is a statue of Nelson Mandela outside the Houses of Parliament in London. Ask yourself, who was vindicated by history? As Thomas Paine put it, time converts more than reason. We are on the right side of history, and we know we are. Only 60 years ago, it was said that the main things that came out of Israel were oranges, obviously Palestinian, and false teeth. But today, Israel is in the top 6 exporters of arms in the world. 10% of its exports go on weaponry. About 5% of its national budget goes on research and development. And I would just like to say thank you so much to Adam and the comrades at Leeds University for really leading the charge. We saw a situation where Leeds University was forced, not by choice, not by an awakening of its conscience. The parameters of the logic of these institutions will be defined by the students at the institution. It won't just happen without any pressure. And that is something that we know only too well. Leeds University divested our holdings from Airbus, United Technology, and Key Ents corporations. They've been worth over $1.2 million. We can't forget the victory of HSBC, where after 24,000 emails targeting HSBC, you saw them withdraw their investments from Elbit Systems. That was a very long campaign that we must also remember. The positives that we have, obviously the NUS has a BDS policy, big up to Malia and others that have been pushing that for a long time. We have seen victories. We must remember those victories. We must educate the generations coming forward after us about those victories. But also, we must be wary of what is to come, because those like us are very much, as they say in Arabic, we are in the sniper's scope. And we are not in a position where we can afford to be complacent. We are in the battle to confront the culture of power with the power of culture. I am honored to be involved in this campaign, and I look forward to the days ahead when we can continue our struggle.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lowkey. It's very hard to follow up from that. I think you touched on so many different points, and to end on the brilliant example of the Boycott South African Apartheid movement is extremely moving. And we know that, you know, when the students really elevated the campaign and started marching in their thousands, it was quite a pivotal moment in the Boycott South African Apartheid campaign. And there's so much energy and drive now in the student movement to build and to accelerate the campaign to get Apartheid Off Campus, that hopefully, just like the victory at Leeds and HSBC, we can see that replicated everywhere. So I would like to just again thank all of the speakers. We are going to have a short Q&A session. If you would like to contribute, please do it through the Q&A box. The chat, contributions are only available through the Q&A box, and that's just to minimize any potential disruptions. I would like to encourage anyone who's listening, who's a student, who's about to become a student, or even a recent graduate, or anybody who wants to support the network, who abides by our aims and values, to get involved. We've got a form where you can fill in your details and become part of the network, get in touch with your local group, your regional group, and the national network to kick Apartheid Off Campus. Please do follow us on our social media channels. On Facebook and Instagram, it is @Apartheid Off Campus. And on Twitter, it is @AOC_movement. We've only been launched for 2 weeks. We've already got 3 articles written by incredible students, which is on our website. We've got our first podcast launching this week, and we have lots of online actions planned for whilst we're in the COVID-19 global pandemic situation. And we're also ready and getting ready to mobilise when it is safe to do so across the UK, to make full use of this network across different struggles. So please do get involved. I believe that it's been posted in the chat, these different ways that you can become involved in this movement to kick Apartheid Off Campus, because it's only with everybody here and everybody who has sympathy towards Palestine, turning that sympathy into active solidarity, that we can win this campaign across the UK and also involve our comrades across the world, and of course Palestine, in our fight to do so. I would also like to take a moment to also encourage people to support the Justice for Joseph campaign. We have Justice for George campaign, sorry, and we have seen that a black man was killed by American police officers, and today was the revealing of that video. And I'm sure for anyone who's watched it, it was extremely haunting, and it's an acceleration and continuation of the oppression of black Americans in the US and across the world. And with struggles who are fighting against oppression, we ally ourselves, and the Black Lives Matter have put themselves out there in supporting the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and we support the Black Lives Matter movement just like any struggle fighting for social justice. I would, so I'll go on to questions. We have got quite a few, so I'm very sorry if your question doesn't get answered. I'll go one at a time to begin with, and just let me know, or any of the speakers, if you would like to be, if you would like to speak on that question. So the first question is, with several universities in the UK promoting a decolonising mission, and I think Malia, you touched upon this brilliantly. Meanwhile, allowing these ties to colonial institutions to continue, how can universities detach from the metaphor of decolonisation to actively implementing it?
Is it a question any of us can answer?
Yes, it is. So, Lowkey, if you would like to speak.
So I mean, it's such a big question. I think it is important to focus on realistic goals. However, I went to an event about decolonising the university at Kent University. Now, this is not specific to Kent, but I think often conversations about decolonising these days can focus on the micro before the macro, and discount the micro as a manifestation of the macro. So what I mean by that is a lot of it might be based on implicit things, microaggressions, other things like that. I don't think that that is necessarily a good or effective place for people to put energy into. In the example of Kent, for example, what I found was that the university was not only deeply involved with BAE systems in terms of a sort of conveyor belt of students directing it towards the company, but also was involved in the Ministry of Defence's psychological warfare unit and ways of reading the actions of people within the military. So designing stuff that was about reading the behavioral patterns of people within the military in order to understand you're in a situation where already 1 in 10 of the people in the British military are not British citizens, where many of them are from former British colonies. You have a real crisis in terms of people who want to join the British military. And so in order to work on understanding people's thought processes, Kent University played a really integral role in a lot of the research around that stuff. For me, understanding decolonization has to start with institutions before it starts with feelings. Because when we're talking about people's feelings, talking about the emotional side of things, those are, number one, subject to change, but number two, an extension of the structural and macro issues. Focus on the institutions, focus on what is realistic in terms of, number one, making visible those entanglements between educational institutions and military institutions. And I think that's where energy should be focused. Personally, I'd be interested to hear other people's perspectives on this.
I think I would add, like everything else, if you know the realities of your institutions, the interests of management and those at the top, it is profit. At times there might be ideological and political agendas, who knows, but ultimately the direction of travel has been the marketization and privatization of higher education. Therefore, to challenge it on that basis means ensuring there is constant pressure from below. Like, we cannot trust that management have suddenly internalized a decolonial perspective and really have a deep desire to pull everything from its roots. Do not be under any illusion that that is what is happening once they decide to stick the decolonial campaign in those brochures. So on that basis, it's about building a sustainable cross campus base between academics, between students, and even staff members. And I go back to the example of the academic boycott campaign that took place at SOAS. Everybody could vote, every single staff member across campus, because it takes absolutely everybody to make that campus, to run that institution, and to continue to allow the profits to continue for those at the very top. On that basis, that collective community has to make it clear to those from the top that without them, there is no institution, there is no university, there is no source of income for them. And power and whatever else. And so I think that no matter how good it feels or seems, or how much you're gaining ground, do not neglect building grassroots campaigns and maintaining them, because also you need accountability for leaders that emerge within that space as well, for those that the university may be suspiciously happy to bring in as spokespeople or to sit on particular trustee boards or whatever else. There constantly needs a space of accountability for that as well, in order to ensure the political direction of the project. But Lowkey said, please be under no illusions.
Thank you, Malia, for that contribution. Yeah, I think it's so powerful what you said about, the institutions are nothing without students and academics. And often when I would go to speak at university about this topic, it would be the question posed to me is, what power do students have? And really it should be, well, what power does an institution have without the students, without the staff, without everyone else? And yes, there's so much power and ability for when students and staff and everyone on campus is mobilised to actually make these things happen and to make change happen on those campuses. Adam, did you want to contribute to that question, or shall I move on to the?
Just a really small point, because I think a lot has been said. A really important thing, and I have to agree with especially what Lowkey has said about, you know, the feeling. And this is something that me as an activist in Leeds have faced a lot of the times. You know, they try to assure you, you know, no, we're on your side. You know, how are you feeling? The point is that there is a cause that we're fighting for. There's an injustice that our institution is complicit in, and you know, anyone who sort of believes that the institution, as was said before, takes any of these steps by their own sudden awakening is totally, you know, misled. But importantly, decolonization also has to be understood through the links that many of the institutions have to colonial projects, you know, which essentially are Israeli universities, you know, like Hebrew University or Herzliya, which is built on the ruins of a Palestinian village. So if you divest, or if you decide to boycott these institutions, you are decolonizing your campus, you are decolonizing your university. And this is what we have to understand as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for those incredible contributions. I'd just like to add to that. I mean, I think that, you know, the thing about decolonization being added to university brochures, etc., and it reminds me of when we do the research on universities' investments, and we see that the majority of them have socially responsible investment policies, which was kind of, you know, a fad in 2009, where people were talking more about corporate social responsibility. And you'll see policies being created. A lot of the time, the actual investments in these companies are not made transparent, so you don't have a clue if they're actually abiding by these without doing further research. But then we actually see that when they are called out on investing in companies like Caterpillar, who have been reported as contributing to human rights violations by major human rights organisations, the University of Manchester, for example, will ignore that fact. So a lot of it is a facade and part of, you know, the branding of a university. And a lot of, I guess, what students and activists on the ground have to do is expose the facade and expose the complicity, and encourage and motivate people to get involved in decolonising the campuses. But I will move on to the next question. And again, just I'll put it to all the panelists. What do the panelists think is the biggest / unique contribution that campaigns in higher education can make to the wider BDS movement? On a historical note, could the speakers also pinpoint what they believe made the role of students in the South African anti-apartheid struggle so powerful? Would anybody like to go first?
Would it be possible, Huda? I don't know if anyone else particularly feels passionately about this particular question. Would it be okay if we read out about 5 questions at a time, and then we answer? Is that okay? And then we answer which ones we want to answer, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I'll do 3 at a time.
No one has a problem
with that. The first one is about pinpointing the role of students in the South African apartheid struggle, which made it so powerful. Another question is, as well as investments, this complicity includes research projects and educational exchanges, which directly involve uni staff and so are politically more sensitive. What are the obstacles in targeting those activities? What help could come from academic staff locally and nationally? And then the third question for this round would be, how can students effectively use language to fight against this discourse of violence and suppression of Palestine activism on campus? Adam, would you like to go first? Because you got your hand up.
Yeah. So I just want to come back on the second question, which was about the particular challenges that face activism directed at academic boycotts. You know, one of the many things that's often cited in opposition to this is academic freedom. Well, let me tell you about academic freedom in Israeli universities. An Israeli student once did a research project on the effects of the Nakba, on the demolition of the village that was on the space that the university currently occupies. I believe it was the University of Haifa. The student was supervised by Ilan Pape, no other. And he received full marks on this, and it showed new evidence on the ethnic cleansing of that village. You know, more than hundreds of Palestinians were killed and forced out, and historical buildings were destroyed, apart from them being obviously spaces that people lived in and called their homes. Now, when this student was targeted by Zionist groups within Israel, and they were kicked out of the university, along with, we must say, Ilan Pappé was eventually forced to resign as well. So when you talk about academic freedom, look at the institutions that we're targeting. They do not respect academic freedom, and they are deeply complicit in the Israeli apartheid regime by holding investments and by obviously doing research for arms and arms technology. Sorry, could you just switch the video on my, because I'm speaking, it's currently not on me, thanks. So as I said, they are complicit not only in the arms company, but also in developing the ideology that supports the ongoing apartheid. So this is how you counter some of these challenges, I would say. And when it comes to the help from staff and other organizations, there's Breakup, British Universities for Palestine group, which is an incredible group which has put forward many manifestos and programs that support our work and that are really effective at doing it. So I would say, one more thing which is really particular about the academic boycott, which is that that was something that the major activists from BDS in Palestine said, we take them to places that they cannot resist, they cannot bomb SOAS, as we say. So this is incredibly frustrating, and Israel derives a lot of its legitimacy and authority and whitewashing from these universities. So if you hit them there, they will it, and they are scared of that.
Thank you, Adam, for that. Does anybody else want to feed back on any of those questions?
I'm just having a problem with volume at the moment. 1 second.
No problem. No problem. Would you like
maybe
to
if Malia wants to answer
when you get your connection
for the moment? 1 sec.
Okay.
Happy to. Yeah, I think just to quickly cover a few of them, I think that higher education provides an important space because it allows for the redevelopment of national networks and local ones even. It provides a space in which you can educate campaigners. It also plays a role in the ability to reconquer public spaces in relation to Palestine solidarity work, and even the launch of practical campaigns that are rolled out, whether within a particular city, region, or even nationally, whether it's boycotting arms companies or Israeli institutions, and we can actually, with this particular space, we can actually be very explicit in what it is that we're targeting, and hopefully as well potentially their success. I think in terms of South Africa, of course, students' role was important because universities are an important institutional network in which knowledge is produced, in which people are mobilized and informed about the realities of the world and political spaces. And I think that the pressures, what the particular campaigns by students against apartheid in South Africa were also seen on a national scale, to the extent that eventually the National Union itself, that it was impossible to ignore, that resources, energy, and time had to be put towards ending apartheid in South Africa and providing that solidarity. And we need the same in Palestine. That it has to be unquestionable. And I think that in terms of the university staff and academics, again, coming back to launching campaigns of academic boycotts are essential to this, even if, let's say, you do take the example of a referendum and it is not successful. The participation in that, the awareness, in the process of launching that campaign, of organizing people around it, is really crucial. And it may mean that later down the line there is success, but also engaging staff is important, because should like academic boycotts be successful locally on campuses, they're the ones that are going to have to undertake its implementation. And I think that you can also lean on the fact that UCU have national policy on BDS. So that is also a way to encourage and rally around that particular question. In terms of language, finally, we have to talk about and re-talk about and continue to repeat and shout about the question of colonization, about Palestinian resistance, and the ongoing century-long nature of Zionism in Palestine. That it's not new, that it's not just about Israeli occupation, and I think that the commemorations of the Nakba recently were an important opportunity to do that, that we should be discussing colonialism and the fact that, you know, it didn't start in 67. And in terms of where we look for agency and positive responses, we find that a lot of like focus is given to critical Israelis and their organizations instead of building links with Palestinian groups and activists, including, for example, Bazait in the West Bank or Gaza University, and trade unions within that space. And so that is also something to think about.
Those are both great answers. Is it okay if I just make one quick point about language? Now, language on this issue is a contested space, and it's important that we look at organizations like Unit 8200 and the cyber unit of the IDF. What they work on is a few things. One of them is combating what they call the war of discourse, and making sure that certain narratives appear to be organic rather than the creation of agencies such as this. The other thing they do is they police the freedom of expression of Palestinians. You have, for example, Darlene Tatur, who put online the poem "Qawim ya Sha'bi Qawim," and she was arrested for incitement because she called for resistance, which of course, as we have established in the Palestinian context, is armed resistance is not against international law. In terms of other people, you have had people who have been arrested for posting things which are just, you know, we're talking about really, really simple sentences which have been misconstrued by the IDF as incitement, not that that makes it okay. The other thing that these kind of units work on is deleting people's accounts from Facebook. And we have seen that Facebook has been, and Twitter also, have been open to working with the Israeli government on deleting people's presence from the cyber sphere. So this is really the main space where language is produced and spread in the current period that we live in. And because of that, Israel has quite sophisticated ways of trying to squash that language, trying to algorithmically disappear certain narratives from people's minds. So we have to be really assertive in the way that we're pushing these things forward. Secondly, on language, there's a great book written by David Miller and others called Bad News for Labour, about the anti-Semitism quote-unquote crisis. Now, one of the things that they put forth is if you have less than 0.1% of a membership of a party accused of something, does that qualify as a crisis? No, it doesn't. And not that I want to get bogged down in semantics about anti-Semitism, but let's also not forget that the person who originally coined the phrase Zionism was a gentleman by the name of Nathan Birnbaum. He later became one of the most staunch anti-Zionists that has ever been known. Look him up and look at what he said about the Zionist project and how his change of heart came about. It is clear that the war of language is absolutely integral to this process. And we must continue to assert that Zionism, we're not talking about the Martin Buber Zionism. We're not talking about spiritual Zionism, right? Which called for peaceful immigration and no state building. We're not talking about Leo Pinsker, non-Palestine centric auto-emancipation Zionism. We're not talking about Hebrewites who believe that Palestinians should be converted to Judaism. That's quite another story. We're not talking about those that believed in a form of binationalism. They referred to them as the Five Guys, big-time capitalists of the period. What we're talking about is Jabotinskyite Zionism, which is dominant and which has been the reason that you have seen the ethnic cleansing and the colonial project. Those are the two dominant trends within Zionism, right, which led to the foundation of the State of Israel, was Ben-Gurion, Laborite, kibbutzist Zionism on one side, and Jabotinsky Zionism on the other side, Stern Gang. One side believed they could get statehood by allying with the British. The other side allied with the British at different points. You know, Jabotinsky was trained by the British. Both Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion trained and were in the British Army in World War I. But they believed in attacking the British and fighting the British in order to get statehood. These are the dominant forms of Zionism. Both of them are racist. Both of these forms of Zionism had Palestinians down as the indigenous population, whether it's Ben-Gurion or Jabotinsky. They both had that down as clear. We have to be clear about those definitions and fight them where we must. And yes, we must build alliances as far and wide as possible, also to lead on from Malia's point.
Thank you. I think those are incredible responses to those questions. I will go on to the next set of questions for now, and we'll see what time that leads us to, and then I'll say some final remarks, or maybe some more questions if time permits. But the next set of 3 questions, the first one is, apart from ending university complicity, oh, actually, sorry, that's the wrong question. Palestinian activism has often been targeted by institutions like Prevent. How can we support the movement while stopping the demonization of Muslims on campuses? What books or works would the panelists recommend for people to gain a better understanding? And how can we advocate AOC, Apartheid Off Campus, to other student activist groups as an intersectional issue? I'd also just like to take a moment to come back to somebody's question who I believe was submitted before the webinar started about how to find out about university complicity. The database was initially published on PSC, but we do have the database updated and built on our website, apartheidoffcampus.org. So you can go on there and find out about university complicity and other ways to get involved. But I'd like to go over to the panelists. Does anyone want to begin? Adam, go ahead.
I'm just gonna jump right into the first question about Prevent. Yes, Palestinian activists, and not only Palestinian activists actually, you know, Muslim rights activists, environmental rights activists, people who are dissidents in general. What Prevent does, it targets dissent from, let's say, the government's official stance, something that it views that is, and sorry, could you just switch again because it's still on Huda, the video.
It's on you, Adam, to me.
Oh, sorry. There it is. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So as I was saying, it targets dissent from the official policies of the UK government. You know, and what we do to fight this institutionally racist, you know, targeting of dissidents. What we do is actually we get more radical. We organize together and we show our unity, because if we are targeted by this one institutional, let's say, strategy that's been, you know, put forward by the UK government and exercised by different universities, what we do is that we unite and we recognize that we are targeted together, and we fight against it by running campaigns, raising awareness, and essentially pressuring all the universities to stop and to, you know, not to have these prevent officers on their campuses. And this actually has been done, you know. So the NUS has a brilliant campaign called, which is obviously, we have the person here, Malia, you know, who started the students not suspects and staff not informers. If I'm not too weak, that's the name of the campaign, which was absolutely amazing, you know, because we are students and we don't deserve to be suspected of you know, whatever acts might threaten the UK government. What we want is to have more just universities and institutions and stop the complicity of these institutions in apartheid and human rights violations. And I think this thought is not radical. This thought is completely logical and understandable, just as was communicated before. So yeah, let's get more radical and organized, basically.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Kareem.
Go ahead. Are you sure?
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask for a repeat of like the questions very briefly, apart from the prevent one.
That would be good.
I'm sorry.
Would you like me to do that before you speak, Lowkey? Okay.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So the one, you got the one about prevent. So just to go over that, I'll go over all of them for simplicity. Palestinian activism has often been targeted by institutions like Prevent. How can we support the movement while stopping the demonization of Muslims on campuses? The next question is, what books or works would the panelists recommend for people to gain a better understanding? And the third question, how can we advocate Apartheid Off Campus to other student activist groups as an intersectional issue?
Okay, so what I'll start with is, I would say the duty of care, as I understand it, for public sector employees is that if somebody indicates to you that they are going to do something that harms somebody else, then you have a legal duty to report that. The Equality Act of 2010, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that it prohibits people from discriminating against people due to their religious identity or their political beliefs. Now, in the name of doing what the duty of care should be doing, Prevent calls on people within the public sector and now increasingly in the private sector to violate the Equalities Act of 2010. A clear question that should always be offered to people when making the argument for Prevent. Number one, Chris Hunter, expert in terrorism for the British government, has said clearly that your chances of being in a terrorist attack in this country are 1 in 16 million. Do you believe that a threat level that is 1 in 16 million justifies 3-year-old children being questioned by police without the presence of their parents? If you believe that to be so, then there's something clearly wrong here on a societal level. Prevent exists in a symbiotic relationship with the big funders of think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society. It exists in a symbiotic relationship with the Sun, with the Daily Mail, with the mainstream media, and Rupert Murdoch put it clearly, actually. He said, not all Muslims are terrorists, right? But until we've got rid of this cancer, all Muslims have to take some form. I mean, it was literally collective punishment that Rupert Murdoch was advocating for. And I didn't say his quote verbatim, by the way, but I was paraphrasing what he said. It exists in a symbiotic relationship with British foreign policy. It exists in a symbiotic relationship with people like Katie Hopkins, who, by the way, according to a Guardian interview that was published with her several years ago, supposedly signed a 35-year contract with military intelligence. Her education at Exeter University was paid for by the British, in economics, was paid for by British military intelligence, according to her, not me. She then trained at Sandhurst and only is not in the British Army now because she has epilepsy. All of these things are interconnected and exist at the same time. If you're going to ask people in public sector jobs to look hypercritically at Muslim children or people who are racialized as Muslims as children, yeah? Okay. Then how do you expect that not to spill over into violence against people racialized as Muslims on the street? And of course, the Palestinian cause is wrapped up in all of this because it is identified as an emblematic struggle that people who, in terms of this thought policing and this totalitarian way of dealing with people, if they feel some type of sympathy or recognition of Palestinian humanhood, then in this twisted threat inflation-based way of seeing the world, are more likely somehow to be on a conveyor belt towards committing an act of political violence. Mark Sageman, in his book, Misunderstanding Terrorism, says that in the period after the war on terror, according to the arrests of people in the world, it was less than one in every million Muslims in the world who had anything to do with terrorism, okay? Of the something like 180 people in jail for terrorist charges in this country right now, between 70 and 80% of them are in jail for non-violent charges. We're talking about the possession of literature. It's about what's in your head. It's about thought. It's about pre-crime. So as an irrational policy that Prevent is, we have to build a wide coalition of people that see it in that way, that see it as a cash cow for the sycophantic and the mercenaries and the worst of our society at any time. In an unprecedented economic depression that we will be in off the basis of this COVID crisis, you are going to see similar mechanisms of the Islamophobia industry that have become prominent across the last decade and a half, aimed at Chinese people also. They will be irrationalized. They will be perceived as culturally inferior, as lesser human beings. And every minutia of who Chinese people supposedly are will be problematized in the press. Mark my words, you will see it, especially in a situation where China is due to overtake the United States as the world's #1 economy by 2030. So not to go too far away from the Palestinian issue is actually about asserting universal rights for human beings. If you agree with 3-year-olds in nurseries being questioned by police without the presence of their parents, then you've got something in common with those who want to muzzle Palestinian solidarity in this society. In terms of books, though, I'm not sure.
I thought you would take that question first.
So in terms of books, I was going to say Ben White's Guide to Apartheid. I'm not sure what's going on in my ears. It's some feedback maybe. Ben White's book on apartheid in Palestine is great. I would also recommend Bassem El-Ra'ed's book, Hidden Histories, is amazing. Really, really amazing. I've really enjoyed that. Noor Masalha's book, Expulsion of the Palestinians, is also an important one too. You've got the Hidden Histories there. Amazing, fantastic. What a book. What a book.
Wait, can you see it yet? It's
Fading into Jerusalem, but yeah. Malia, did you want to come back on those questions?
Sure. Maybe coming off the book thing, like if you're in a place where you can purchase books, because I know access to libraries right now is impossible, check out Verso. Verso have some incredible books, and I believe they're having a 50% off sale at the moment and 80% off ebooks.
Wow.
I don't look for Verso, so I'm not trying to like plug it on a commission for it, I promise. Pluto is also great. All the radical online bookstores, Haymarket, Bookmarks. I mean, there's quite a few, so I would check those out. Also, like following certain voices, you can even go on like Lowkey's like Twitter feed at times, and you can find quite great academics or like political analysts that you can follow, or some of the interviews that you've done as well has kind of helped me with some resources actually.
No, not at all, not at all.
True. If you go through people's like Twitter feeds of people they've like retweeted, or that or whose quotes they've included, or articles they've shared, that's quite a helpful link into. And also like the process of researching those things really interesting, because you also find like the areas of interest that you have. Also, particularly on radical questions like Palestine solidarity and resistance and so on, you will often find free online books, or ask some of those academics, ask some of the people for like a free PDF, because chances are they're politically on your side and want the sharing of knowledge as much as possible and widely as possible. In terms of the intersections, I think that like particularly on campuses, sometimes it can feel like the academic year is limited to, I mean, effectively 1.5 terms because of exams and deadlines and so on. And so thinking about key dates, key history months, and how like the cross collaboration can happen with societies on that particular interest. I think that I was in Algeria joining like some of the weekly Friday protests that have been taking place against the military regime since February. And one of the Fridays was dedicated to extending solidarity to Palestinian women who are opposing like the patriarchy effectively, and like misogyny and the whitewashing of their contributions to the liberation struggle and so on. So, and you know, that is a country that is deemed so much more cut off from the rest of the world, you know, strict borders, often internet blackouts. And so I think that in many ways we have no excuse to be bridging some of those struggles as well. In terms of prevent, I think like, again, we've reached the point where like our approach to the prevent strategy has to be more radical, dare I say, has to be more confrontational. We have adopted so many methods, we have launched so many campaigns, we have like the toxicity of the name itself is at such a heightened level, yet it continues and it strengthens, and more policies, bills and so on like continue to be passed like on a government level. And so, you know, the call now is for civil disobedience, is for all-out boycotts, and that is going to be incredibly challenging, particularly at a time where we've re-entered another financial crisis, where higher education, particularly in the UK, people are foreseeing like will be completely disseminated, be completely destroyed. People will be losing their jobs. So some won't deem this to be a priority, but actually it is part of the very fight that we should be thinking about, because if we are going into an all-out crisis, then we have to be thinking about what it is we want to how we want to reconstruct, and what demands we need to be met in that process of reconstruction. Now really is the time to strike, and if only to get us through this crisis, but more deeply, so that we get through it with a better, more just and equal, not just higher education system, but society as a whole. And so on that front, if we are talking about an all-out boycott, then that certainly relates to the campaigns and methods that we want to be adopting on a Palestine solidarity front. I think that it's no surprise that the targeting of Palestine activism is caught up in the counter-extremism framework, because the narrative is hugely, is massively not in our favor. And so we are like the base of dissidence, as you said, that is deemed worthy of on-campus and societal level violence, over-policing, and even dehumanization. So our struggles like have to be bridged.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for all of the. Adam, do you have a final contribution?
Yeah, thanks. I just, because I felt really like I want to also share my library with you guys. By the way, Lowkey, I actually met Bassem in Palestine. It was incredible.
Wow.
It was great.
Amazing, amazing.
I can pass his email. He would love some feedback on his new book, I'm sure.
Oh, wow. His new one?
Yeah.
So he has a new one after Hidden Histories?
So he's writing one right now.
Wow.
Actually,
I can't wait for that to come out.
Actually about Black resistance to slavery. So really, really cool stuff.
Right. Okay.
Interesting. Apart from that, I would really recommend people to read Remzi Baroud's new book. It's called These Chains Will Be Broken. It's about stories of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and it's really empowering. And actually, most of these stories are written by women, and it's really, really, and also a very good analysis of the very core of the Palestinian issue. Also, I'm really, happy that Malia is with us, because of the Algerian struggle as well, which I see so deeply connected to the Palestinian one. So I would suggest reading Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, obviously. And also, we don't only write serious, it is serious, but we also write very beautiful works of art, which is Mahmoud Darwish's Unfortunately It Was Paradise. I would suggest you reading that as well. And other than that, everything has been said, I think. So just thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that is a lot of reading for everyone to get going whilst in this current lockdown situation. I want to thank all of the speakers again for not only being here today, but for the support, not just now with the new Network for Apartheid Off Campus, but the continuous support for the social and environmental justice movement that we are all a part of. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Just to say again that if you're interested, you don't necessarily need to be already involved in a society on campus. If you're interested in getting involved in the network, do fill in the form, do check out our website, all our social media channels, and get involved. It's for everyone who has a passion for social justice to get involved, to help mobilise, and to, until we can do it in person and protest, to be doing online actions and building the platform. And I would also like to recommend everyone to read the Apartheid Off Campus articles that we have up. We have one by Reem Mohammed, a student at Sheffield Hallam University, where she speaks about her experience confronting an arms dealer from BAE Systems on her campus. And there are many other students as well from different groups who are going to be speaking about their movement, their campaigns, and what's happening across the UK. And the first podcast will be out this week. But yes, again, I would like to urge everyone to support and follow in any capacity possible. We are all eager to drive this campaign forward to be as successful as possible and build across the struggles as we've spoken on today. I'd like to thank from the bottom of my heart and appreciate all of the students who are already a part of Apartheid Off Campus, which there are many from across the country, and many who are behind this webinar and not being shown and are behind their little screens, but are building and working towards making Apartheid Off Campus possible. And this webinar would not have been possible without their support. And so thank you everyone for attending. I think we will leave it at that. I'm sorry if your question didn't get answered. You can email us at any time, any other questions. Thank you again to all of the speakers.